Hi, I'm Jonathan Horn, the author of The Fate of the Generals, MacArthur, Wainwright, and the Epic Battle for the Philippines. I want to thank Alex Kershaw and the Friends of the National World War II Memorial for inviting me today. My daughter and I just had the pleasure of visiting the memorial in Washington, D.C. And as we were walking around and looking at all of the pillars, each of the pillars representing a state or territory that came together to help the United States win World War II, my daughter pointed to one of the pillars for the Philippines. And it's a reminder of what so many have forgotten, that the Philippines was once a colony of the United States. And it was in the Philippines that the United States suffered its worst defeat of World War II. We're here today to talk about two generals who both served in the Philippines during World War II. Two generals who both received their nation's highest military award for their actions in the Philippines, the Medal of Honor. But two generals who I think you will see found honor itself on very different paths. Now, writing this book was a bit of a departure for me. I had previously written books about George Washington and Robert E. Lee. What drew me to those topics really was just simple geography. They had lived most of their lives on the Potomac River, and so had I. True, they had lived on the Virginia side of the river, and I am from the Maryland side of the river, but that was a small difference. It was so convenient writing about them, perhaps a little too convenient. So one night, as I was thinking over my next book, I said to my wife, I think instead of writing about two people who made history on the other side of the Potomac River from me, I should write about two people who made history across a slightly larger body of water, the Pacific Ocean. And now, this was in the middle of COVID when crossing the river wasn't so easy by various different regulations, to say nothing of trying to cross the Pacific. But my wife was nothing but supportive. But what I'd like to do today is to tell you and answer the question that I think my wife herself was thinking at the time. Why this topic? And also to tell you a little bit about how I went about writing the book. In truth, writing this book, the biggest jump I had to make was not one of space, but one of time. My editor at Scribner suggested that I write about something a little bit more recent than the founding era or the American Civil War. He wanted me to write about the 20th century. Now, that was a little bit intimidating to me. I was born in the 20th century. I spent a lot of my life in the 20th century. I didn't know how I would feel about writing about it. But as I began looking at World War II, it really did feel like a long time ago. And it also did feel that the character of the American people had changed in significant ways since then. And that's not necessarily a good thing for us. Now, that's not to say there weren't big egos back then. There were big egos. And there were generals who liked to read their headlines. And none was more famous than Douglas MacArthur. You probably remember him today as he wanted you to remember him, with his corncob pipe, the sunglasses, and the gold braid on that famous cap. What drew me to MacArthur really were the three most famous words he ever uttered. He said them after he had received orders to abandon his army in the Philippines and to escape to Australia with his wife and young son. When he reached Australia, he said, "I shall return." Now, those words have become so famous that they have overshadowed a vow that another very different general made in the Philippines. His name was Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright IV, and he was the second highest ranking officer in the Philippines to Douglas MacArthur, and he became the highest when MacArthur left. And he made a very different vow, and that vow was to stay in the Philippines, to share the fate of his army, even if it meant surrendering with them and becoming the highest ranking prisoner of World War II. Now, as I looked at these two stories and these two vows, it seemed you couldn't understand one without telling the story of the other. You couldn't understand the vow to return to the Philippines unless you understood the story of the man who had vowed to stay. The stories of MacArthur and Wainwright seemed to belong in the same book. And then I found what was my big break. Boxes of Wainwright papers, diaries, letters, and other personal documents. in military archives. It had been more than 40 years since anybody had written a biography about Jonathan Wainwright. And in that time, these papers had been deposited in government archives. And as a result, many of them had been totally unexplored. So I knew I had a great opportunity, but I also knew I had a serious problem. I couldn't write this story without seeing the places where the history actually happened. And to do that, I needed to go to the Philippines. But as I told you, this was in the middle of COVID, when international travel was very hard and the Philippines had its borders closed. But the moment the Philippines opened its borders, I was on a plane to Manila. Now, there are more than 7,000 islands in the Philippines. And the largest and most populated of those islands is called Luzon. It lies south of Taiwan. If you approach it from the air, it looks a little bit like a dragon with its wing outstretched to the northeast, its tail spiraling off to the southeast, its head facing the South China Sea to the northwest, and its front legs extended into a peninsula called Bataan. And behind those legs, and in the space between them and the rear legs, hind legs, is a bay called Manila Bay. And along this bay, on the belly of the beast, you find the city of Manila. And that's where I landed. Now, people in the United States may have forgotten why the Philippines has its own pillar on the World War II memorial, but people in the Philippines have not forgotten. They have not forgotten the long history that binds the United States and Philippines together. They have not forgotten that the Philippines was a colony of America's. They have not forgotten what price Wainwright and his men, including American and Filipino troops, had to pay for the desperate last stand they waged against the Japanese when they invaded the islands shortly after Pearl Harbor. And they have not forgotten what it took for Douglas MacArthur to fulfill his famous vow to return. And if you visited the Philippines, you would remember too, because there are reminders all over the place. If you go to Manila, you'll find the thick stone walls around the old city. It was Douglas MacArthur's father, Arthur, who led the first American troops inside those walls in 1898 during the Spanish-American War and saw the American flag hoisted above them. It was from his father that Douglas MacArthur learned that the Philippines were the key position to America's future as a Pacific power and the key to spreading democracy around the world. And you can see some of those aspirations in the Philippines if you visit a park called the Luneta. It looks like a tropical version of our national mall with palm trees, and on the peripheries are neoclassical government buildings that showed how Americans hoped to plant the seeds for an American-style democracy in the Far East. And nearby, you'll find the Manila Hotel, which the Americans built, and where Douglas MacArthur was living with his wife and 3-year-old son in the run-up to World War II, when Douglas had what he thought was the most important job in the world, defending the Philippines. But if you look a little bit closer at all of the things I just named, the stone walls, the neoclassical government buildings, the Manila Hotel, you'll discover something disturbing. They're all reconstructions. And that's because something terrible happened. As much as MacArthur wanted to save Manila, he could not. And to understand what went wrong, you have to start, I think, by going north to a place called Fort Stotzenburg, which was one of the most important forts that the Americans had in the colonial period. If you had visited there shortly before World War II began, you would have seen a very elite cavalry unit called the 26th Cavalry. These were Philippine scouts, elite Philippine troops, led by American officers, and they were playing a polo match. But if you had visited on December 8th, 1941, just hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, remember, the Philippines is on the other side of the international date line, so one day ahead, you would have seen something very different. Japanese bombers flying overhead, dropping their bombs on nearby Clark Field. You would have felt the convulsions, and you would have seen the bulk of America's Air Force in the Philippines be destroyed. And you would have seen out of the commander's house on the fort come a tall 6'2" man He was very skinny, but skinny in the tough sort. Everyone called him skinny. This was General Wainwright. He had spent some of the formative years of his childhood near the site of Custer's last stand at the Little Bighorn. He had always wanted to become a cavalryman, but he never knew that he would one day have to fight a last stand of his own. He had plans to be heading south for a meeting that day with MacArthur, to tell him he had concerns about MacArthur's plan to defend the Philippines with Philippine conscripts. Wainwright had seen these troops, and through no fault of their own, they had not received the proper training or equipment they would need to be able to contest the Japanese if they landed. But as soon as he saw those planes bombing Clark Field, he knew he had to head north, to Lingayen Gulf, where everyone expected the Japanese to make their landing. And you can head north to Lingayen Gulf too, and see where the Japanese made their main landing on December 22nd, 1941. And very quickly, what Wainwright feared would happen on those beaches did happen. Douglas MacArthur hoped that the Philippine Army would be able to throw the Japanese back into the sea. That couldn't be done. And very quickly it becomes clear that American forces in the Philippines are going to have to fall back on a much older plan, a plan called War Plan Orange. Instead of attempting to defend the full coastline of the 7,000 islands of the Philippines, the plan calls for just defending a small portion, the mouth of Manila Bay. And to control the mouth of Manila Bay, you have to control two key positions. One is the Bataan Peninsula, and the other is a tadpole-shaped island off the tip of Bataan, an island called Corregidor. The job of leading the retreat to Bataan falls to Wainwright. It is both a delay in action and a retreat, because he has to hold open the road to Bataan so as many American forces can reach there as possible. But when they do get to Bataan, they found the jungle was so thick in places that even veteran soldiers could lose their way. If you go to Bataan, you can have some understanding of how 1,000 Japanese troops were able to break through the main line of resistance that the Americans built and simply disappear into the jungle, and nobody even knew where they went. The front in Bataan really could be anywhere, but the Japanese were never the main danger on Bataan. The real danger were mosquitoes spreading disease, vitamin deficiencies caused by food shortages. Food was a serious crisis from the very beginning of Bataan. Very quickly, the men have to go down to half rations, and then eventually down to quarter rations, if you can believe it, which is about 1,000 calories a day. Wainwright, the old cavalryman who had grown up loving horses, he thought he would never have reached Bataan. His army would have never reached Bataan without the service of the elite 26th Cavalry, which was still fighting on horseback at this time. Has to give an order that he never wanted to give. For the horses of the 26th Cavalry to perform one very sad service, to be eaten by his army. There's no other choice, and this is the end of the last great horse-fighting unit in American history. As Wainwright put it, Bataan was a hopeless hell. Now, things weren't much better on Corregidor, where MacArthur and his family had gone after declaring Manila an open city in the hopes that the Japanese would spare it. Now, if you go to Corregidor today, you can see that perhaps it might have once been a pleasant post in the years before World War II. You'll see a movie theater. You'll see pleasant houses where the officers could have lived. There was even a golf course. Americans built golf courses wherever they went. But you'll find that they're all in ruins, because very quickly the Japanese begin an aerial assault on Corregidor, and the most important feature on the island instead becomes a tunnel complex that the Americans have built through a hill called the Malinta Hill. This is the Malinta Tunnel, and it's able to serve as a bomb shelter for about 10,000 men, and it becomes the headquarters of American operations in the Philippines. But when the Japanese bombers fly overhead, Douglas MacArthur likes to go out and see them, and people wonder, why does he like to run these risks? Well, he thinks it's important for people to see a general sharing the risks of the men. Unfortunately, the people who most need to see MacArthur's example didn't see him very much, because he only made one visit across the water to Bataan, which was only a few miles away. Perhaps he couldn't bear to tell them the truth, that the help he had promised was on the way was not actually coming. He had begged Washington to send help, But over and again, he got the same answer. There was no way to break through the Japanese blockade, and there were attempts, but very little help gets through. It's amazing, in fact, that MacArthur and his family managed to get out, to get to Australia. I think you'll be astonished as you read about their daring escape on a PT boat. It wasn't MacArthur's idea to go. He received orders from President Roosevelt. I think MacArthur would have been willing to die in the Malinta Tunnel. He said, on Corregidor, he said the Japanese would never take him alive. But at this time, perhaps you can understand why the decision was made that MacArthur had to be called out. If you looked around the Pacific at places like Hong Kong and Singapore and the Dutch East Indies and Guam and Wake Island, everywhere the Japanese are having success. Only in the Philippines is there evidence that America and its allies are fighting back. And in the minds of the American people, that fight is inseparable from Douglas MacArthur, because Douglas MacArthur has control of the only means of communication with the outside world, the radio. And his communiques tend to mention only one person's name, his own. So he does receive these orders to go to Australia, where he'll make his famous speech, "I shall return." And people often ask, why did he say "I shall return"? Why didn't he say "we shall return"? Wouldn't that have been more magnanimous? Well, the truth is it would have made no sense at the time, because the United States had not left the Philippines. We were still there, fighting on Bataan and Corregidor and other places in the islands. Wainwright would be called to take command of the full Philippines by Washington after MacArthur left, and he would move his headquarters to the Malinta Tunnel. Now, there are some who tell Wainwright around this time that he should try to leave the Philippines too, or at least try to relocate to one of the southern islands to save himself. But he makes a vow, and you can find it on the first page of a new diary that he begins on April 2nd, 1942. He says he will share the fate of his men and surrender with them if necessary. He holds to that vow even when Bataan surrenders on April 9th, 1942, the largest surrender in American history. He holds to that vow even when the Japanese move their big guns to the tip of Bataan and putting Corregidor on a 24-hour bombardment. He holds to that promise even as the walls in the Malinta Tunnel shake, dust comes down, the water system breaks, the lights flicker out, and the tunnel goes into absolute darkness. He holds to that vow even when the last submarine departs and he knows the Japanese will soon make their landing. He holds to that vow because he said no other course of action would be honorable. Honorable. That's a word we're talking about a lot. And in Australia, MacArthur will receive the Medal of Honor. And you might think that's a little curious because the Medal of Honor, of course, is reserved for facing great danger and risking your life above and beyond the call of duty. And what MacArthur did, through no fault of his own, because he received orders to do it, seemed the antithesis of what the medal represents. But people in Washington were very concerned about what our enemies might say about the captain deserting the sinking ship. And to offset enemy propaganda, they, in a sense, decided to make the Medal of Honor itself, America's highest military award, a form of propaganda and give it to MacArthur. But it might surprise you to know that shortly afterwards, MacArthur receives a proposal from George Marshall to give the Medal of Honor to Wainwright. And MacArthur objects vehemently. And he says Wainwright doesn't deserve the medal. In truth, he's furious at Wainwright because by this time, Wainwright has made the decision not only to surrender Corregidor, but also to surrender the rest of the Philippine Islands. And Wainwright did it knowing that MacArthur might never forgive him. But he felt he had no choice. The Japanese had landed on the island and they had their tanks ready to go into the Malinta Tunnel. And he could see a massacre, and the Japanese would not accept his surrender unless he agreed to include the full Philippine Islands. So much in Wainwright's life will unfold from that vow that he makes on April 2nd, 1942. From that one page of his diary comes so many. The pages explaining his decision because he worries that Americans back home won't understand the decision he made. The pages cataloging him losing weight in Japanese prisons as his weight goes down to 142 pounds. The pages following as the Japanese move him from a prison in the Philippines to Taiwan and eventually all the way to Manchuria. But one thing you won't find in that diary, not overtly at least, you have to look for it on a different level perhaps, but not overtly, is a bad word about Douglas MacArthur. Wainwright, even when he comes home, never says a bad word about Douglas MacArthur. When asked by people, he will always say Douglas MacArthur was one of the 3 best generals in American history. The other 2, if you're curious, he says, are Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. Now, even his own son will say, no one will ever know what Dad really thought about General MacArthur. Now, that wouldn't be a problem for one Harry Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt to the presidency. When Wainwright is released and finally does come home to the United States in September 1945, Harry Truman happily gives him the Medal of Honor that he believes he deserved all along. But he also goes further than that. Truman says that he thinks his predecessor made a serious mistake. He rescued the wrong general from the Philippines. He should have rescued Wainwright and left behind MacArthur. He says that if we had rescued Wainwright, we would have had a real general, not a play actor or a stuffed shirt. And keep in mind, by the way, this is all years before Harry Truman's famous feud with MacArthur over Korea. Truman just hated MacArthur. But I think as you read my book, you will realize that President Roosevelt had his reasons. He understood in those desperate days in 1942 that America had needed 2 very different generals. We had needed a general for the headlines and a general for the front lines. No general as self-centered and as certain of his place in history as Douglas MacArthur could have made the sacrifice that Wainwright did, not to die a glorious death on Corregidor, but to become a prisoner of war at the hands of the Japanese and to suffer great humiliations and deprivations. And no general as committed to the chain of command and uncomfortable with celebrity as Wainwright could have done what MacArthur did, to hold 130 million of his fellow citizens to his promise to a very distant island chain on the strength of his words alone. America needed both these vows to be kept. And I think as you read about MacArthur's vow to return to the Philippines, you will see that there were, along the way, many times it could have gone awry. There were some who said returning to the Philippines was a detour from the main mission of defeating Japan. But MacArthur always said we had a moral obligation, and his vow became a national commitment, even though it tragically ended with the Japanese destroying the city of Manila in a climactic battle 80 years ago in February 1945. That brings us back to the city of Manila, but it's not where I want to end today. I want to end closer to home, in the city of Chattanooga, Tennessee. If you had been there in November 1863, you would have seen Confederate guns during the Civil War entrenched on top of Missionary Ridge, and you would have seen 23,000 Union soldiers begin a charge over open ground, and what will become perhaps the most improbable rout of the Civil War when they succeed. About halfway up the ridge, Douglas MacArthur's father, Arthur, will grab a flag and lead his regiment to the top, carrying that flag. It's an act of great courage. There are many others who do similar things that day in that marvelous victory. But as Douglas MacArthur remembered the story many years later and told it many years later himself, he could see only one person doing that feat, his father. And I think something similar has happened with the Philippines. When we look back at America's experience in the Philippines during World War II, we remember only the vow that Douglas MacArthur made. We have forgotten the vow that Wainwright made. I hope with this book, we can fix that. We can restore Wainwright to his proper place in history and tell his story where it belongs, side by side with legendary Douglas MacArthur's in a place of honor. To General Wainwright fell an assignment as above and beyond the call of duty as any performed at Missionary Ridge, not carrying the flag up a ridge, but staying to see it surrendered at that sickening hour of surrender. Let that be the fate of no American soldier ever again. Let that always be above and beyond the call of duty. Thank you very much, and I'd be honored to answer your questions.
Hi, Jonathan. How are you?
Very good. Thanks for having me today.
Can you see my cap? Can you see this?
I can. Are you wearing that just for me?
Yeah, I'm wearing it only for you. Very special day that I would put this Yale hat on. The only reason is for you, and it was difficult to do. It's actually a dark blue, so I don't mind that because my alma mater is also dark blue. So there you go.
I figured you were wearing it for General Sutherland, MacArthur's chief of staff.
No. So your book was published like actually 3 or 4 days ago.
Tax day here in the United States through no intentional reason, but that's the day it came out, and I hope to give people a reason that they like to spend money on tax day.
Yeah, well, I think the IRS classifies royalties from books as different from standard income. So hopefully you're going to have a very big bill from the IRS this time next year. I really enjoyed the book. I thought it was really, really well written. It was very interesting. I have to admit that I came away from the book more and more convinced that MacArthur was a thoroughly objectionable human being. Now, I'm being perhaps a little bit controversial. I'm being provocative saying that, but he's not a very nice guy. He's not a very pleasant man. And I think his treatment of his fellow warrior hero General Wainwright was I'll be honest, it was despicable. It was unforgivable. Can you tell us about in particular MacArthur's actions in terms of nixing and wanting Wainwright not to receive the Medal of Honor when he himself had received the Medal of Honor in very controversial circumstances, and I believe didn't deserve it?
Yeah, and I think it's everybody looks at Douglas MacArthur's Medal of Honor that he received after reaching the safety of Australia in 1942. And it is impossible to justify on actual the grounds that the Medal of Honor is awarded today, that General MacArthur received that medal. Um, General George Marshall was very eager to give the medal to MacArthur. It was known that all of his life, General MacArthur had really wanted to receive the Medal of Honor. It's often said nobody wants to win the Medal of Honor because to win it requires such sacrifice above and beyond the call of duty that no one could rightfully want to be in a position to have to get this medal. But that's not true of Douglas MacArthur. He definitely wanted to win the medal all throughout his military career. It was the one medal he was missing. His father had won it. And there was this concern in Washington about what would the Japanese say about the general deserting his army to starvation and surrender. This was going to be a propaganda coup for the Axis powers. And to offset that concern, there is a decision in Washington, and really is spearheaded by George Marshall, to give MacArthur the Medal of Honor. And you can see that Marshall even writes that there are no, he looks for an act that will justify it. And MacArthur has, in fairness, exposed himself to danger in the Philippines, but nothing approaching the Medal of Honor standard. And Marshall admits it in his correspondence and says we still have to proceed with giving him the medal. And that's why I think it's so sort of audacious and astonishing when, after the surrender of the Philippines has taken place, um, George Marshall goes back to MacArthur and proposes giving the Medal of Honor to Wainwright. And you can read the message that Marshall sends to MacArthur, and it sort of sounds like it's just an FYI, this is going to happen, and I assume you have no objections. But as it turns out, MacArthur has some very serious objections. Um, I think MacArthur makes his objections on several different levels. He's furious, first of all, to say that Wainwright has surrendered not just Corregidor, but the full Philippine Islands. He seems to be incapable of processing why Wainwright would have made that decision, that Wainwright foresaw a massacre in the Malinta Tunnel, even though I think MacArthur himself saw the potential for this when he originally left the Philippines. Um, but it's more than that. For MacArthur, the Medal of Honor always brought back the image of his father, carrying the flag up Missionary Ridge in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and for it to go to someone who ordered the flag to be lowered, to be struck, sort of for him cut at what the medal was. And so he basically threatens Wainwright's reputation. He says, if you go forward, George Marshall, with awarding the Medal of Honor to Wainwright, you'll force me to go public with some very unsavory comments about that will hurt Wainwright's reputation and hurt the Army's reputation. And I think it's, if you read between the lines, what he is saying, he is going to say that Wainwright is drinks too much. Um, and there's no question that Wainwright did drink. Drinking was very common in the Army, and it was especially common among cavalry commanders, which Wainwright was. Um, but what's so curious about this accusation, or the insinuation of it, is that if MacArthur had such concerns about Wainwright's judgment, why did he leave Wainwright in charge, not of the full Philippines? Washington did that, but he did leave him in charge of the most important position in the Philippines, Bataan, the entire Bataan Peninsula, and all of Luzon. And why did he do that? So I think when you look at this, it really is MacArthur just not being furious at Wainwright and not wanting him to get it, and believing that surrendering should not receive the Medal of Honor.
Do you think the push and the push to have MacArthur received the Medal of Honor? I think when he received it, he was the first son of a recipient ever in history. Do you think the push to have MacArthur rewarded, and also later at the war's end having Wainwright receive the medal, do you think that was part of a broader propaganda campaign, which basically boiled down to the fact that we had failed spectacularly in the Philippines? And I'll add to that, December the 7th, 1941, people are taken massively by surprise, or not, although not everyone. Um, and what's happening in the Pacific is a national disgrace. It shows how unbelievably unprepared America is for Japanese expansionism in the Pacific, or rather, how little we did in the face of it. So, do you think it was a concerted effort to at least take two figures in that debacle and say, you know what, we've had these heroes, they're great leaders, etc., etc. I can't imagine Eisenhower or Bradley or Patton receiving the Medal of Honor. None of them obviously did, for failure, and we were rewarding surely failure.
I think that's fair. And to be perfectly honest, the written record supports the fact that MacArthur's Medal of Honor was, in fact, given for propaganda. There's just no question about that. You can argue about whether MacArthur might have deserved the Medal of Honor earlier in his career, but that medal that he received in Australia in 1942 was given to offset enemy propaganda. And in a sense, as in an effort to offset enemy propaganda, George Marshall and Franklin Roosevelt made America's highest military honor into its own form of propaganda. As for Wainwright's medal, I don't personally see it that way. I think you can argue that today perhaps neither of these men would have received the Medal of Honor, and that's nothing, no slight at Wainwright. But if you just look at the situation, everybody, in a sense, in the Philippines, all of our soldiers in the Philippines have been asked to do something that I think should always be above and beyond the call of duty, which is we had an army across the ocean, and we knew in the event of war, and we had a plan, but we knew it wasn't going to work. And this was because our country had been unwilling to shoulder the burdens of being a great military power in the years before World War II. And because we were unwilling to pay that price, our soldiers paid a terrible cost in the Philippines. And so this is, as you said, a national failure for the United States. And I think Wainwright is a symbol of that national failure, but he's also a symbol of his perseverance during his years, and the honor and sacrifice with which he carried it make him a great hero to me.
Yeah, and especially when you think about what happened to the commanders at Pearl Harbor, they were called back to the United States and disgraced, basically. They were blamed for a broader failure. I want to get to some questions. Janice Blake, who's going to be speaking next, um, she asks, I wonder how the American public viewed these two generals as events unfolded. Uh, was MacArthur popular from the very beginning, or did he become increasingly the symbol of American resolution and grittiness in the Pacific?
I would say both. In a sense, he was America's most famous soldier in the years before World War II, and you look at the events in the Philippines, and you look at hours after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese basically catch the bulk of America's Air Force in the Philippines on the ground and destroy it. This is the calamity at Clark Field. And yet MacArthur's popularity in the country only grows. And I think if you look at the situation in the early months of World War II, you can understand what's happening all across the Pacific. The Japanese are basically succeeding with very little resistance, and only in the Philippines can Americans find what they so desperately seek, which is evidence that we're fighting back. And that effort, as I said in my remarks, really does become synonymous with Douglas MacArthur. And as a result, you have people naming their babies after Douglas MacArthur. You have proposals for memorials here in Washington, D.C. That's when we get MacArthur Boulevard. This is all happening in real time. No one is waiting to see how these events play out. They're actually proposing memorials and monuments. Wainwright was much less famous. In fact, when MacArthur finally does leave, um, there's a newspaper article that refers to Wainwright as the unknown general who's taking command in MacArthur's stead. And I think largely that's because MacArthur's persona is so large that it's hard for anyone else to get any sort of copy in newspapers. And of course, I guess part of this question also is how did Americans perceive Wainwright after he makes this very difficult decision to surrender? And I think Wainwright, of course, in prison, the worst form of torture he faced, perhaps, because he faced beatings, he faced systematic starvation, was not knowing whether the American people would ever forgive him for this decision he made. And you can see that in his diary when he's just spending pages and pages trying to justify the decision. And I think the hardest part is knowing that he knows MacArthur is not going to approve the decision. But the American people do understand, and Wainwright becomes a hero to them. He's on the cover of Time magazine, and when he returns home, he has a ticker tape parade in New York City, and of course, he does receive the Medal of Honor from President Truman at the White House, and President Truman says nothing could have given him more pleasure. And I think part of that is also his own hatred for Douglas MacArthur, which started long before most people realize.
We have another question here. What was MacArthur's other greatest accomplishment in the Pacific Front? I don't want to add too much, but quite a few serious uh, American leaders and politicians really had a very intense dislike for MacArthur. Truman, as far as I know, from what I've read, really couldn't stand him. Truman also had a problem with anybody who was a showboater, didn't have much time for Patton either. But notably, Eisenhower, will be talking to his granddaughter later on this morning. Eisenhower had spent a lot of time under MacArthur, and he saw the real guy. He had plenty of opportunity to see the real MacArthur in action, and he was not impressed. He thought he was basically an egomaniac. How good was MacArthur actually as a general in the Pacific War? Was he really that good?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, and obviously it's a very big question. And to Eisenhower, I mean, you look at Eisenhower's diary that he's keeping while he's working at the War Department, and during the early months of the war, he's sort of put on the question of how to get relief to the Philippines. This is his first assignment from George Marshall that Eisenhower receives. And I mean, you can see Eisenhower is referring to MacArthur as a crybaby, but we have to keep him fighting. And these are tough entries. And Truman will be calling MacArthur a stuffed shirt, a prima donna. And this is during World War II. It's important to say, not during the Korean War, when everybody knows, of course, how that relationship ended. I think as I look at MacArthur, I think his biggest contribution, in a sense, was his keep forcing America to live up to its obligation to the Philippines. And I am somebody who agrees with him in the sense that he believed we had a moral obligation to return. The Philippines to him was not just some another island chain that could be bypassed en route to Japan. This was American soil. We had suffered; these were American colonies. We had suffered really a complete military debacle there, and we had failed the Filipino people, who were, again, it's important to say, part of the United States. And so, since we had been forced out at the point of the bayonet, we had to return the same way. And I think as you look at all the efforts that were made during the course of the war, there was nothing inevitable, in a sense, about returning to the Philippines. There were many proposals at different times that argued that we should bypass the Philippines. And MacArthur, it really was MacArthur's word that held America to that commitment to the Philippines.
That's a really interesting point you make because quite a few people would argue that island hopping, part of that strategy, it wasn't very well thought out in the sense that an awful lot of Americans died and civilians died. If the objective was to get straight to Tokyo and end the war as quickly as possible, we kind of went a long way around the bushes. And my opinion is that if you look at the eventual horrific destruction, the well over 100,000 civilians killed in Manila alone during the fighting to retake what was an American colony of only maybe 50 years. Surely you could argue that MacArthur again was somewhat damaging to overall war aims. We should have bypassed the Philippines, done everything we could to defeat the Japanese as quickly as possible, and then the Philippines could have resumed a much less damaged post-war um, relationship with the United States. I mean, how do you feel about the overall strategy in the Pacific of really bowing to MacArthur's own ego and his sense of guilt that he hadn't surrendered, that he wasn't there when they surrendered, and that surely would also explain his actions towards Wainwright, that he felt guilty, that he should have been there, he should have surrendered with his men, or at least fought with them to the bitter end.
Well, and first of all, I think the point you made is critical to take on, which is that the destruction of Manila in 1945 was one of the great atrocities of World War II, and it is the great irony of Douglas MacArthur's vow to return, is it ends with the Japanese destroying the thing that MacArthur most wanted to save. This is for MacArthur. This is, I mean, he has kept his vow, but for him, this is a cataclysmic spiritual destruction. This is the city that his father led the first American troops into. This is where he had his son was born. This is really his home, Manila. He loves Manila, and it is destroyed. And he watches the Manila Hotel burn before his eyes. I mean, he's just watching the Japanese torch it. And so, yeah, this is the great irony of his return. That said, I still believe, first of all, that responsibility for that is on the Japanese. Now, you can say MacArthur should have known that this could have happened this way, and yes, but I do think we had a moral responsibility to return to the Philippines, as for the reason that MacArthur said. And I think ultimately Roosevelt himself agreed with that. This wasn't just another place. It wasn't just another island chain. And there is this dramatic conference with Roosevelt, Admiral Nimitz, and MacArthur at Pearl Harbor, where they hash out this strategy. And MacArthur does, in a sense, prevail in the discussions, and it's not so straightforward as I just told it right there. But he does carry the day, and for both strategic and moral reasons, is able to convince that the right course of action is to make the return to the Philippines.
So, looking at MacArthur's life as a whole, what I'm most impressed with is the restoration of Japan. In fact, the formation of modern Japan. Surely we can say that MacArthur had more to do with that than any other individual. Can you talk about a little bit about that? Because I think this is the overwhelmingly redeeming chapter in MacArthur's life is when you look at Japan today, you have to say that it wouldn't exist without MacArthur.
Yeah, I think you look at his legacy of coming in to Japan, and just it's hard to overstate the destruction of Japan that he found, and then the leadership he showed in helping to rebuild the country. I agree. This is his great legacy, and I think other MacArthur biographies, I'm thinking of D. Clayton James, and have also found the same, that this is MacArthur's great legacy. And you look at the relationship between the United States and Japan and where we are in the world today. I mean, Japan was our great enemy during World War II, and now they are. I mean, the most important ally we have, I would say, in the Pacific. And you look at that relationship, and that is Douglas MacArthur. And I do want to also say a word about the Philippines too, because the Philippines, if you look at the geography of the world today and where America's alliance is in the Pacific, is a critical position too. And one thing I discovered as I was writing this book is that people in the United States, and I think this is evident in the tone of the conversation today, have very strong feelings about MacArthur, and often not positive. But in the Philippines, I found anyway that MacArthur is still a hero, and his name, the United States is very well liked in the Philippines. I'm talking broadly here, of course, but MacArthur is still a beloved figure, and people do associate those words, "I shall return." There were good reasons for saying "I" at the time, because the United States had not left the Philippines, but it was, in a sense, a personal pledge from someone who did love the Philippines and did consider it his home.
Can you tell us just briefly a little bit about the post-war careers and relationship between Wainwright and MacArthur? I think you brilliantly trace their interaction through the book, but can you tell us a little bit about what happened after the war? Did they reconnect? Did they write to each other? Did they stay associates?
Well, so I guess the big question everyone might be wondering is, what did Wainwright think of MacArthur? Was he
Yeah.
bitter toward MacArthur? And I'll tell you, Wainwright's wife had to leave the room every time she heard MacArthur's name. Uh, Wainwright himself, and you find this in his diary, he has an entry for advising other officers, and he says, "Never criticize your superior." And there are some hints in the diary of moments when he's resentful about various different things. But for the rest of his life, when he's asked about Douglas MacArthur, he'll always give the same answer. He'll say Douglas MacArthur was one of the three best generals in American history. And the other two, if you're curious, are Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, in Wainwright's opinion. And even Wainwright's own son will say that nobody will ever know what Dad really thought of Douglas MacArthur. And I think uh, so that's one part of it. But Wainwright, in fact, goes further. He seconds the nomination for Douglas MacArthur for president, uh, and during one of MacArthur's unsuccessful bids to become the Republican nominee for president. So that's the kind of guy Wainwright is. I do want to say one thing about Wainwright's post-war life, because it is a tragic story, and I think it's an important one to point out, which is all throughout these years as a prisoner, you can see him looking forward to living the rest of his days whenever he gets out with his wife. That's one of the things that's sustaining him. And when he gets home, he finds that his wife has become addicted to alcohol and to sedatives in his absence. And so, in a sense, he is denied the happy ending he wanted, because he has to make the very difficult decision to have his wife institutionalized. Um, and there are attempts to bring her out at various different points, but it always ends up the same way. And it obviously couldn't have been easy being with him, because he had sort of been forced into this uncomfortable celebrity lifestyle that he was never really comfortable with either. But there were always parties and with drinking, and it was no environment for someone who was struggling with addiction. And so I think in Wainwright's story, we're reminded of the sacrifice that our prisoners of war have made for our country, but we're also reminded of the sacrifice their families have made for our country. And no one embodies that sacrifice more than General Wainwright's wife.
I think that's a very, very, very important point to mention the fact that millions and millions of American women also suffered greatly throughout World War II. I want to say thank you so much from friends. I'm still wearing your cap, and I wish you all the best with the book. It's a wonderful read. I urge everybody with us this morning to shout from the rooftops about this wonderful, wonderful book. I think you did a great job. It's a lovely take on two very interesting American generals from World War II. And I thank you for joining us. If you ever
Alex,
feel out to,
Alex, Don Patton, can I
oh,
ask you a question?
yeah, very quickly, because we've only got a minute left on.
I know, but if you recall at the surrender on the Missouri, MacArthur handed the signature pen to Wainwright,
Yeah.
and we had a speaker here in Minnesota that was in the OSS and was part of the expedition of getting Wainwright relieved from Mukden to be on the Missouri. There must have been something there, reconciliation. I just question that issue.
Yeah, very, very good point. And Jonathan covers it very, very well in his awesome book. So thanks, Jonathan.